It was one of those quiet Thursday evenings when the world feels like it's slowing down just for you. The kind of evening where everything falls into place and life seems to give you a little break from its usual chaos. For this man, it was supposed to be a moment of peace, a chance to unwind after weeks of grinding at work. He had booked a table at an upscale restaurant downtown, known for its elegant ambiance and mouth-watering dishes. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was the spot people talked about, the one with soft lighting, crisp white tablecloths, and servers who moved around like they were part of some perfectly choreographed dance. He walked in wearing a sharp suit that screamed professionalism but also hinted at someone who knew how to enjoy the finer things in life. His tie was neatly knotted, his shoes polished to perfection. As he stepped through the door, the faint hum of conversation filled the air, blending with the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. He felt good, confident even, as he made his way to his reserved seat by the window. From there, he could see the city lights twinkling outside, a gentle reminder of the busy streets beyond the calmness of the restaurant. The waiter greeted him warmly, handed him the menu, and left him alone to soak in the atmosphere. He took a deep breath, letting himself relax for the first time in days. This was his space, his moment. Nothing could ruin it, or so he thought. But then, something changed. A figure appeared near the entrance, a police officer on what seemed like a routine patrol. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He wore the standard uniform, carried himself with authority, and surveyed the room with practiced ease. But as he scanned the tables, his eyes landed on the man sitting by the window. And in that instant, the mood shifted. The officer hesitated for a second before making his way toward the table. There was no friendly smile, no casual greeting. Instead, there was an unmistakable tension in the way he approached. The man noticed it too, though he didn't say anything. He simply looked up, curious but calm, waiting to hear why the officer was heading his way. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice firm but not exactly warm. "We've received reports of disturbances here tonight. Can you explain what you're doing?" The man blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm having dinner," he replied, gesturing toward his half-eaten plate. His tone was polite, almost amused, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Is there a problem?" Instead of answering, the officer studied him closely, his gaze lingering on the suit, the watch, the overall demeanor. Then came the words that sent a chill running down the man's spine. "This isn't your kind of place." For a moment, the man froze. Those 6 words hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't shouted or screamed. They were delivered, matter-of-factly, as though stating a universal truth. Yet their impact was undeniable. The implication was clear. Somehow, in the officer's mind, this man didn't belong here. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of who he was. "What do you mean?" the man asked, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Why are you singling me out?" The officer ignored the question entirely, choosing instead to double down. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the premises immediately, for everyone's safety." The absurdity of the situation struck the man like a freight train. Safety? What possible threat could he pose while quietly enjoying his meal? But arguing felt futile. The officer's stance was rigid, unyielding. So, swallowing his pride, the man stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the restaurant without another word. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool night air hit him, snapping him back to reality. He glanced back at the building, still processing what had just happened. Humiliation burned inside him, mingling with frustration and disbelief. How could this happen? In such a public setting, in front of witnesses no less. But as he stood, there staring at the glowing sign above the entrance, something else began to stir within him. Resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one man being unfairly targeted. This was about power, privilege, and the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. And as he climbed into his car and started the engine, he realized something important. The officer had picked the wrong person to mess with. Little did the officer know this man wasn't just anyone. He had connections, influence, and a platform he could use to make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. With every mile he drove away from the restaurant, his determination grew stronger. By the time he parked outside his apartment, he already had a plan forming in his mind, a plan that would change both their lives forever. The car ride home was anything but peaceful. The man gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The officer's words echoed in his head. "This isn't your kind of place." Each time they played back, they stung a little more. He thought about the way the other diners had glanced at him, not with sympathy but with indifference. Some had even looked away entirely, pretending not to notice the awkward confrontation unfolding right in front of them. He parked his car outside his apartment building, but instead of heading inside, he sat there for a while, staring out the windshield. His reflection stared back at him, tired but determined. He knew what had happened wasn't just about one bad cop or one rude comment. It was part of something much bigger, a pattern that people like him had been dealing with for years. And tonight it had landed squarely on his shoulders. For a moment he considered letting it go. After all, what could he really do? Fighting back meant risking backlash, opening old wounds and stepping into a spotlight he hadn't asked for. But then again, staying silent felt worse. Every time someone walked away from an injustice without speaking up, it gave those in power permission to keep doing what they were doing. No, this time would be different. This time, he decided, he wouldn't let it slide. Back inside his apartment, he shrugged off his coat and tossed it onto the couch. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. Sitting down at his dining table, he took a deep breath and pressed record. "Hey," he began, looking directly into the lens. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a mix of frustration and determination. "I want to talk about something that happened tonight because I think it's important. About an hour ago, I was kicked out of a restaurant by a police officer who didn't have any real reason to approach me in the first place." He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "This officer came up to me while I was having dinner, accused me of causing disturbances, and told me to leave. Now, here's the thing. He didn't ask anyone else in the restaurant to leave, just me. Why? Because of how I look. That's racism, plain and simple." As he spoke, his tone shifted slightly. The initial anger softened into something steadier, more focused. "But here's the kicker. This isn't just my story. People deal with stuff like this every single day. Maybe not always in such a public setting, maybe not always involving cops, but it happens. And most of the time, nothing changes because nobody speaks up." He leaned closer to the camera now, his expression serious. "Well, I'm speaking, up tonight. And I'm not going to stop until something is done about it. If you're watching this, share it, talk about it. Let's make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug like so many other incidents before it." When he finished recording, he watched the video once, making sure it captured exactly what he wanted to say. Satisfied, he uploaded it to social media with a short caption, "Enough is enough." Within minutes, notifications started pouring in. Likes, comments, shares. Friends messaged him privately, offering support. Strangers chimed in, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and thanking him for speaking out. By midnight, the video had gone viral. Meanwhile, the officer, the one who had ruined the man's evening, was completely oblivious to the storm brewing online. Back at the precinct, he filed his routine report, noting the incident at the restaurant in vague terms. To him, it was just another day on the job, another minor interaction that he assumed would fade into obscurity. He didn't think twice about it as he clocked out and headed home. The next morning, however, things started to unravel. As he arrived at the station for his shift, he noticed his colleagues whispering among themselves. At first, he brushed it off, assuming they were talking about something unrelated. But when his sergeant called him into the office, his stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. Inside the office, the sergeant avoided eye contact, shuffling papers nervously before finally speaking. "There's been some attention surrounding an incident last night," he said carefully. "Apparently a video surfaced online. You might want to take a look." The officer frowned, confused. What video? What incident? Then it clicked. The restaurant. The man in the suit. The guy he'd asked to leave. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. By lunchtime, the video had exploded across social media platforms. Thousands of people had seen it, and the hashtag Justice for Him was trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying calls for accountability. Protesters began gathering outside the police station, holding signs that read, "No, more excuses," and "Racism has no place in uniforms." The pressure mounted quickly, and the department found itself under intense scrutiny. At first, the officer tried to downplay the backlash. He figured it was just noise, people blowing, things out of proportion as usual. But as the hours passed, reality set in. Internal affairs summoned him for questioning, demanding an explanation for his actions. Colleagues who had once joked around with him now avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable. Even his friends outside the force seemed hesitant to defend him. For the first time in his career, the officer felt vulnerable. He had always believed he was untouchable, shielded by the badge and the authority it represented. But now, faced with overwhelming evidence of his bias and the public outrage it had sparked, he realized he might not walk away unscathed. Back at the man's apartment, the whirlwind of attention continued. Reporters called non-stop, asking for interviews. Activists reached out, eager to collaborate. Messages poured in from people thanking him for standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. It was overwhelming, yes, but also empowering. For the first time, he felt like he was truly making a difference. Still, he knew the fight was far from over. Viral videos and hashtags could only do so much. Real change required action. So, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He reached out to trusted allies, lawyers, journalists, community leaders, and started planning his next move. Together, they drafted letters to city officials, organized rallies, and pushed for transparency within the police department. One afternoon, as he reviewed documents related to past complaints against officers, he stumbled upon something shocking. The officer who had humiliated him wasn't a one-off case. Records showed a disturbing pattern of discriminatory behavior stretching back years. Multiple witnesses had come forward in the past, only to be ignored or dismissed. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, painting a picture of systemic failure. Armed with this new information, the man decided to escalate matters. He scheduled a meeting with the mayor, presenting the findings alongside a detailed proposal for reform. Among the recommendations were stricter accountability measures, mandatory anti-bias training, and independent oversight committees to monitor police conduct. The mayor listened intently, nodding along as the man laid out his case. By the end of the meeting, the mayor made a promise action would be taken, not just lip service but concrete steps toward justice. For the man, it was a small victory, but an important one. It proved that speaking up, even when it felt impossible, could lead to tangible results. As days turned into weeks, the momentum kept building. The officer's fate became a topic of national debate, with experts weighing in on everything from racial profiling to police culture. Meanwhile, the man remained steadfast, using his platform to amplify voices that had long been silenced. He attended rallies, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the movement stayed alive. Through it all, he never lost sight of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about revenge or personal vindication. It was about creating a world where no one else had to experience what he had gone through that night at the restaurant. And though the road ahead was long, he knew he was moving in the right direction. The days following the viral video felt like a whirlwind. The man could barely keep up with the flood of messages, calls, and media requests pouring in. His phone buzzed constantly, friends checking on him, strangers sharing their own stories, reporters asking for interviews. At first, it was overwhelming. He hadn't expected his simple act of speaking out to explode into something so massive. But as he scrolled through the comments and read the heartfelt messages from people who felt seen and heard because of what he'd done, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, poring over documents and piecing together evidence that painted a clearer picture of the officer's behavior. What started as personal humiliation had transformed into a mission, a chance to expose not just one bad apple, but the rot in the system that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. With each new piece of information he uncovered, his resolve grew stronger. One evening, while sifting through old police reports, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Complaints against the officer weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern. There were accounts from years ago, cases where people claimed they'd been stopped, questioned, or harassed without cause. Some described being pulled over for driving while black. Others recounted being accused of crimes they didn't commit. Each story was eerier than the last, yet none had led to any real consequences for the officer. What struck the man most was how these complaints had been brushed aside. Witnesses reported feeling dismissed by investigators, their voices drowned out by bureaucracy. It was as if the system itself had conspired to protect the officer, ensuring he faced no accountability. Reading through these files, the man couldn't help but feel anger, not just at the officer, but at the institution that enabled him. This wasn't just one person's misconduct. It was a reflection of deeper issues embedded within law enforcement. Determined to bring these findings to light, the man reached out to a journalist he trusted. She had covered similar stories before and understood the importance of holding those in power accountable. Over coffee, he showed her the documents, laying out the timeline of complaints and highlighting the recurring themes. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "This is huge," she said finally, looking up at him. "If we can get this out there, it could change everything." Together, they crafted a plan. The journalist would write an exposé, weaving together the personal account of the man's experience with the broader context of systemic racism in policing. Meanwhile, he would continue pushing behind the scenes, rallying support from activists, lawyers, and community leaders. They agreed to release the article alongside another video from him, addressing the public directly and urging them to demand action. When the exposé went live, it sent shockwaves through the city. People were outraged, not just at the officers' actions, but at the failures of the department to address them earlier. Protesters gathered outside the police station once again, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "No justice, no peace." Social media lit up with discussions about racial profiling, police reform, and the need for transparency. The pressure on the department became unbearable, but the officer still clung to denial. Sitting in his small apartment, he watched the news unfold, his face pale and drawn. He tried convincing himself that this was all a misunderstanding, that people were blowing things out of proportion. Yet deep down he knew better. The weight of the accusations pressed down on him, heavier with each passing day. When Internal Affairs called him in for questioning, he walked into the room feeling like a man walking to his execution. The investigation dragged on for weeks, with officers combing through body cam footage, witness statements, and internal reports. Slowly but surely, the truth came to light. Other officers, some of whom had worked closely with him, admitted they'd noticed his biased behavior, but had stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. One colleague even confessed to hearing him make derogatory remarks during patrols. Each revelation piled onto the growing case against him, leaving little room for doubt. For the man, watching the process unfold was both satisfying and exhausting. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that justice might finally be served. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the frustration of seeing how long it took for the system to respond. How many more people would suffer before real change happened? He refused to let this moment slip away without making lasting impact. During this time, he also began receiving invitations to speak at events, community forums, panel discussions, even a town hall meeting hosted by the mayor. At first he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and the thought of standing in front of crowds made him nervous. But then he remembered why he was doing this. Every speech, every interview, every conversation was an opportunity to educate, to inspire, to push for progress. So he accepted the invitations, stepping onto stages and into rooms filled with eager listeners. At one event, a young woman approached him after his talk. Her voice trembled as she thanked him for speaking out. "I've been scared to say anything about what happened to me," she confessed. "But hearing you talk gives me hope." Her words stayed with him long after the event ended. They reminded him that this fight wasn't just about policies or punishments. It was about giving people courage, showing them they weren't alone. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the man prepared himself for whatever outcome lay ahead. Would the officer face consequences? Would the department implement meaningful reforms? Or would the momentum fade, leaving the status quo intact? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop fighting. This journey had shown him the power of persistence, the importance of standing firm when it mattered most. And no matter what happened next, he knew he'd already made a difference. In the quiet moments late at night, when the noise of the world faded and he was left alone with his thoughts, he often reflected on that fateful evening at the restaurant. It had started as a simple dinner, a rare moment of peace in an otherwise hectic life. But it had turned into something far greater, a catalyst for change, a spark that ignited a movement. As he looked out his window at the city skyline, he allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. Whatever came next, he'd face it head-on. The investigation into the officer's conduct reached a boiling point. Every new revelation seemed to confirm what many had suspected all along. This wasn't just a single bad decision or an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The man who had been kicked out of the restaurant followed every update closely, his phone buzzing constantly with news alerts and messages from supporters. He knew the stakes were high, not just for himself but for everyone watching. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the system that allowed such behavior to persist. As internal affairs dug deeper, they uncovered more troubling details. Body cam footage from other officers revealed moments where the accused officer had acted aggressively toward people based on flimsy assumptions. In one instance, he'd stopped a teenager walking home from school late at night, accusing him of carrying stolen goods despite no evidence. The teen, visibly shaken, had been released after hours of questioning, only to later file a complaint that went unanswered. Another clip showed the officer making dismissive remarks during a traffic stop, treating the driver with blatant disrespect simply because of their appearance. What stood out most, though, was how often others had stayed silent. Fellow officers admitted in interviews that they'd noticed his behavior but feared speaking up. Some worried about retaliation. Others believed nothing would come of reporting it anyway. It painted a grim picture of a culture steeped in complicity, a system designed to protect its own rather than serve the public fairly. For the man, reading these testimonies was infuriating but unsurprising. He'd seen this kind of thing before, both personally and through stories shared by friends and family. What shocked him was the sheer scale of it, laid bare for everyone to see. Public outrage continued to grow as journalists published exposés detailing the findings. The city buzzed with conversations about accountability, reform, and justice. Protesters gathered outside the police station daily, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding change. Social media hashtags like "Enough is enough" and "Kyang systemic change" trended nationwide, drawing attention not only to this specific case, but also to broader issues within law enforcement. People from all walks of life joined the movement. Students, teachers, business owners, parents, all united by a shared desire for fairness and equality. Amidst the chaos, the officer found himself increasingly isolated. Once a figure of authority, he now faced hostility wherever he went. Former colleagues distanced themselves, avoiding eye contact in the hallways. Neighbors whispered behind his back when he passed by. Even his own family struggled to defend him, torn between loyalty and shame. At home, he spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in his mind. Had he really done anything wrong? Or was he simply being targeted because of his uniform? The questions haunted him, gnawing at his confidence and leaving him unsure of who or what he could trust. For the man, watching the officer's downfall unfold brought mixed emotions. On one hand, there was a sense of vindication. Finally, someone was being held accountable for actions that had gone unchecked for far too long. But on the other hand, he couldn't ignore the sadness of it all, the wasted potential, the broken trust, the lives affected by one person's prejudice. He didn't hate the officer. Instead, he pitied him. Pity, however, wasn't enough to stop the wheels of justice from turning. One afternoon, the mayor called an emergency press conference to address the situation. Standing alongside the man, she delivered a statement that sent shockwaves through the city. After thorough investigation, she began, her voice steady but firm, we have concluded that Officer Name engaged in discriminatory behavior inconsistent with the values of our department and our community. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Effective immediately, he has been terminated from service. The room erupted in applause, cameras flashing as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Outside, protesters cheered loudly, celebrating a victory, years in the making. For the man standing beside the mayor, the scene felt surreal. He'd started this journey alone, driven by frustration and a desire for justice. Now here he was, standing at the center of a movement that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined. But the mayor wasn't done yet. Turning to the crowd, she announced sweeping reforms aimed at addressing systemic racism within the police force. Mandatory anti-bias training, independent oversight committees, and stricter accountability measures were among the initiatives she outlined. This is just the beginning, she said, her gaze unwavering. We owe it to our citizens to ensure that incidents like this never happen again. The announcement marked a turning point, not just for the city, but for the man himself. For weeks, he'd poured every ounce of energy into fighting for justice, sacrificing sleep, time, and peace of mind to keep the momentum going. Now, as the dust began to settle, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. Sitting alone in his apartment that evening, he reflected on everything that had transpired. He thought about the countless strangers who had reached out to share their stories, people who had endured similar experiences but never had the chance to speak up. Their courage inspired him, reminding him why this fight mattered so deeply. He also thought about the officer, stripped of his badge and left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. While he didn't wish harm on anyone, he hoped the man would take this opportunity to reflect, to learn, and perhaps even grow. Yet as much progress as they'd made, the man knew the work was far from over. Policies could be written, officers retrained, and departments restructured, but true change required more than just surface-level fixes. It demanded a shift in mindset, a commitment to listening, learning, and doing better. That's what kept him going, even when the fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. In the days following the press conference, invitations poured in from organizations eager to hear him speak. Community groups, advocacy networks, and even national platforms wanted him to share his story, to inspire others to stand up against injustice. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking still made him nervous, and the thought of reliving the painful details of that night wasn't appealing. But then he remembered the young woman who had approached him after one of his talks. The gratitude in her eyes, the hope in her voice. If sharing his story could give even one person the courage to speak out, it was worth it. So he accepted the invitations, stepping onto stages and into rooms filled with eager listeners. Each speech was different, tailored to the audience and the occasion, but the core message remained the same. Silence perpetuates injustice. Whether it's staying quiet when you witness wrongdoing or failing to call out bias when you see it, inaction allows harmful systems to thrive. Change begins when we choose to act, to speak, to demand better. One particularly memorable event took place at a local high school. The auditorium was packed with students, their faces bright with curiosity and anticipation. As he walked onto the stage, he felt a surge of nerves but pushed through them, focusing on the message he wanted to convey. When he finished speaking, a student raised her hand timidly. "How do you stay brave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, aren't you scared sometimes? The question caught him off guard, but he smiled warmly before answering. Of course I'm scared, he admitted. There are days when I wonder if I'm doing the right thing or if it'll make any difference at all. But here's the thing. Fear doesn't disappear. You just learn to move forward despite it. And when you realize you're not alone, that there are people cheering you on, supporting you, believing in you, it becomes easier to keep going. The audience erupted in applause and the girl nodded, her expression softening with understanding. Moments like these reminded him why he kept pushing, why he refused to let exhaustion or doubt slow him down. Every word he spoke, every story he shared, planted seeds of change in the hearts of those who listened, and while he might not see the full impact of his efforts right away, he trusted that the ripple effect would spread far and wide. As the weeks turned into months, the man continued balancing his advocacy work with his personal life. Friends joked that he was becoming a local celebrity, but he brushed off the compliments, insisting he was just an ordinary person trying to make a difference. Ordinary or not, his actions had sparked something extraordinary, a collective awakening that refused to fade quietly into the background. Late one night, as he sat on his balcony gazing at the city skyline, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The journey had been long, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but it had also been rewarding in ways he never expected. He thought about the people he'd met along the way, the ones who had inspired him, challenged him, and stood by him. Together, they had proven that change was possible, that voices united could topple even the strongest barriers. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not until the world became a little fairer, a little kinder, and a lot more just. The announcement of the officer's termination sent shockwaves through the city, but it wasn't enough to quell the growing demand for accountability. While many celebrated the decision as a step in the right direction, others pointed out that firing one person wouldn't fix the larger issues plaguing the system. The man at the heart of the story knew this better than anyone. As much as he appreciated the outcome of the investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, a small victory in a much bigger battle. In the days following the press conference, protests continued outside the police station. Protesters held signs that read, "One down, many more to go," and "Reform, don't just remove." Their chants echoed through the streets, a reminder that the community wasn't ready to let up. For them, this wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about confronting decades of systemic racism and injustice. The man joined them frequently, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had been fighting these battles long before his name made headlines. He listened to their stories, shared their pain, and vowed to keep pushing for change. But change didn't come easily. The police department promised reforms, but promises were cheap without action. The man decided to take matters into his own hands, organizing meetings with city officials, activists, and legal experts to draft concrete proposals for reform. They worked tirelessly, late into the nights, debating everything from body camera policies to independent oversight boards. It was exhausting work, but the man found strength in collaboration. He realized he wasn't alone. There were countless others who cared deeply about creating a fairer, more equitable system. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting, the group gathered around a table littered with papers, coffee cups, and half-eaten snacks. Someone suggested they celebrate the progress they'd made so far, even if it felt like a drop in the ocean. "We've got a long way to go," the man said, raising his cup of lukewarm coffee in a mock toast. "But every step counts." His words resonated with everyone in the room. Progress, no matter how slow or incremental, mattered. And over the next few weeks, those steps began to add up. The mayor announced plans to establish an independent review board to oversee police conduct. Lawmakers introduced legislation requiring regular audits of law enforcement practices. Community leaders launched initiatives aimed at rebuilding trust between residents and officers. None of these changes happened overnight, but each marked a shift toward accountability and transparency. Still, not everyone was on board. Some within the police department pushed back against the reforms, arguing that they were unnecessary or overly punitive. A few officers even resigned in protest, claiming the new measures would make their jobs harder. Critics accused the man of stirring up trouble, accusing him of being anti-police. But he refused to let the negativity derail him. Instead, he leaned into the criticism, using it as fuel to push harder. During this time, he also faced moments of doubt. There were days when the weight of the fight felt unbearable, when the constant barrage of attacks and resistance left him questioning whether it was all worth it. One night after a particularly draining day, he sat on his couch staring blankly at the wall. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but he ignored it, letting himself sit in silence for a while. That's when his younger sister called. She always seemed to know when he needed a pep talk. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know," he admitted. "Sometimes it feels like we're moving forward, and other times it feels like we're stuck in the same place." She paused for a moment before responding. "Remember why you started this," she said firmly. "You didn't do this for yourself. You did it because someone had to stand up. So yeah, it's hard. But think about everyone counting on you. Think about the people who don't have a voice." Her words hit home. He thought about the young woman who had approached him after his speech, the protesters chanting in the streets, the families sharing their stories of loss and injustice. This wasn't just his fight. It belonged to all of them. With renewed determination, he picked himself up and kept going. As the weeks turned into months, the movement gained momentum. The Independent Review Board began holding public hearings, giving citizens a platform to voice their concerns directly to officials. Officers started attending mandatory training sessions focused on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Slowly but surely, the culture within the department began to shift. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. One afternoon, the man received an invitation to speak at a national conference on policing reform. At first, he hesitated. Speaking to a room full of strangers intimidated him, especially since many attendees were law enforcement professionals who might not agree with his views. But then he remembered something. Fear hadn't stopped him before, and it shouldn't stop him now. Standing on stage, looking out at the sea of faces, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "Change is uncomfortable," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "It challenges us. It forces us to confront truths we'd rather ignore. But it's also necessary. If we want to build a world where everyone feels safe and respected, we have to be willing to do the hard work." The audience listened intently, some nodding along, others scribbling notes. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Several officers approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty and courage. One even admitted, "I never really thought about things from your perspective until today. I'll carry what you said with me moving forward." Moments like these reminded him why he kept fighting. Change wasn't just about policies or punishments. It was about shifting mindsets, fostering understanding, and building bridges where there had once been walls. As he walked out of the conference hall, he allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead was still long, but he could see glimpses of hope on the horizon. And for now, that was enough. Months had passed since that fateful night at the restaurant, but the ripple effects of what had happened continued to shape lives, including his own. The man who had once been humiliated in front of strangers now stood as a symbol of resilience and determination. His story had sparked conversations far beyond the city where it began, reaching people across the country who were hungry for change. But he never let himself forget that this fight wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about justice, equity, and ensuring no one else had to endure what he'd gone through. The reforms within the police department were slowly taking root. The Independent Review Board held its first public hearing 6 months after its creation, drawing hundreds of attendees eager to share their experiences. Some spoke of being stopped without cause. Others recounted losing loved ones to police, violence, Each testimony was raw, emotional, and deeply personal, painting a vivid picture of the pain caused by systemic failures. The man attended every session, sitting quietly in the back row, listening intently. He didn't speak during these hearings, he didn't need to. His presence alone sent a message: you're not alone. Afterward, he would often approach those who had testified, offering words of encouragement or simply thanking them for their bravery. These interactions reminded him why this work mattered, not just for policy changes, but for healing wounds that had festered for too long. One evening, after a particularly powerful hearing, an older woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as someone whose son had been killed years ago during a routine traffic stop. "I've waited so long for someone to listen," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for not giving up." Her gratitude hit him like a wave, leaving him speechless for a moment. All he could do was nod, holding her gaze until she turned away. Later that night, as he drove home, he replayed her words in his mind. They carried both comfort and weight, reminding him that while progress was happening, there was still so much more to be done. Despite the strides made, resistance lingered. Some officers resisted the new training programs, grumbling about political correctness or dismissing the reforms as unnecessary. Critics argued that the changes would undermine law enforcement's ability to protect communities. Even some members of the public expressed skepticism, worried that efforts to reform policing might lead to chaos rather than solutions. But the man refused to let cynicism dampen his spirit. He doubled down on education, hosting workshops and town halls to explain the importance of accountability and transparency. He invited former officers, community leaders, and even victims' families to join the discussions, creating spaces where opposing sides could find common ground. It wasn't easy. Emotions often ran high, but these dialogues planted seeds of understanding that would grow over time. He also launched a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct and advocating for systemic reform. The organization quickly gained traction, attracting volunteers, donors, and partnerships with other advocacy groups. Together, they worked on initiatives ranging from legal aid for affected families to mentorship programs aimed at bridging gaps between youth and law enforcement. For the man, this felt like the most meaningful step yet, a tangible way to turn outrage into action. As the months rolled by, the officer who had started all of this faded further into obscurity. Stripped of his badge and reputation, he struggled to rebuild his life. Friends distanced themselves, job opportunities dried up, and the weight of his actions seemed to follow him everywhere. Rumors circulated about him working odd jobs under fake names, desperate to escape the shadow of his past. While some pitied him, others saw his downfall as a necessary reckoning, a reminder that authority comes with responsibility. For the man, thoughts of the officer rarely crossed his mind anymore. When they did, he felt neither anger nor satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of how drastically their paths had diverged. Where one man had fallen, another had risen. And though karma played its part, it was clear that real change came, not from revenge but from persistence, courage, and collective effort. Years later, the man found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. Life had moved forward in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was still heavily involved in activism, but his focus had expanded beyond policing reform. He now championed broader issues like economic inequality, education access, and healthcare disparities, recognizing that true justice required addressing interconnected systems of oppression. One afternoon, while walking through the same upscale restaurant where it all began, he paused near the window seat where he'd been sitting that night. The place looked different somehow, brighter, warmer, or maybe it was just him seeing it through new eyes. A young server approached him, smiling warmly. "Can I help you with anything?" she asked. He shook his head, returning her smile. "No, thank you, just reminiscing." As he stepped back outside into the crisp air, he glanced at the glowing sign above the entrance. That night had changed everything, not just for him, but for countless others. What started as an act of injustice had transformed into a movement, a legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can emerge if we choose to stand up. And stand up he did, not because he sought glory, but because sometimes standing up is simply the right thing to do.